Hello, this is the second video in this series where we're talking about the certificate for network as per this logical network diagram. So what we've done is we've now installed all of these operating systems. We've got our two zero shell routers. This is our front firewall and this is just a classic router. We've got our Server 2016 installed, our backup server or DC2 2019 server installed, and our Windows 10 machine installed and plugged into the appropriate switches. We've got Red Hat Enterprise installed, but I've got that turned off because it's not really relevant to the rest of the network at the moment. So what we're going to look at first of all is promoting our 2016 server to being a domain controller, and testing we've got access out to the internet. And we want to automate some of these functions so that, for example, we might use a group policy to deploy proxy settings to the rest of the network so everybody else gets out relatively easy. Okay, so let's open up our, you can see I've already got these things running. So I'm just going to go to my first domain controller. Here it is. And remember that the right control key down here is the host key, so right control and delete will send a control alt delete into your virtual machine. If you want to look at the input keyboard, you can see inserting a control alt delete is using your host key plus your delete key. Okay, so administrator, passwords for all of these machines, especially if you've imported these as from an appliance, is always password 9, capital P, password 9. Okay, so obviously you wouldn't do this in a real network, but this is just a development testing network that we're using to develop our skills. If we all use the same password, that's quite fine. It's all about the techniques and not about the security so far. If we do an advanced diploma in network security, then we will put all of the security stuff in place. So here is my Windows Server 2016. It's a data center evaluation version. I've still got 173 days, so that's quite fine. I've already got Chrome installed on this one. I don't know whether I've got Chrome installed on all the other virtual machines, but that's neither here nor there. And I've also got Internet Explorer on this one as well. I think I might have got rid of Edge. When you start any server up, it'll start the server manager up by default. And what we need to do is, the first thing is go down to our local server. And we can see here that I've already called this machine DC1. Normally if you do a classic install, this will have an awkward name. Really awkward name, and trust me, you want to change this because later on when we're doing shares, you'll want to, //DC1 is much easier than / awkward name. However, even if we do have an awkward name, and I don't mind if you do, we're going to solve that problem by creating a DNS alias. And that works quite well. The other thing that we've got on here is I've turned off the firewall on, so if I click on that, it's taking its time to come up. You can see here I've got private network connected, not connected. So I've turned the firewall on or off. So in here, I've got the firewalls turned off. Okay. The reason I've done that is basically I want pings to work, because if you've got firewalls on, then you can't ping the server. Again, this is only for development and instructive purposes for us to test the connectivity. It's not what you would do if you were trying to apply proper security to a network. Obviously you would leave the firewall on, you'd look at the advanced settings and allow pings if you wanted to, so firewall on for most of things and just allow only the features that you wanted to see. Okay, so firewall is off. We have an IP address. This one is already set up to 192.168.3.2. And when we look at our network diagram, here's our server. It's attached to switch 1. We're going to check that in a minute. And you can see that our IP address is 192.168.3.2. So this is correct. The other important thing on here is that the Internet Enhanced Security configuration is turned off. If that is on, then every page you go to, it will ask you to put it on an approved page list. And that gets tedious very quickly. So my recommendation, turn it off. Okay, so this machine looks like it's all set up. What I do want to do is check for the command prompt. Let's just see if the search to find the command prompt work. It does. I'm going to right mouse click and pin it to the taskbar. So it's down here so I can always find it. And what I want to do is I want to first of all check the IP address and then see if I can get out through our network. I want to just test the connectivity. So ipconfig/all tells me the information about this machine here. I can see it's not DHCP enabled, so it's a static IP address. It's 3.2, which is what we wanted. The gateway is set to 3.1, which is, when you have a look at our diagram, is, the gateway for this device is through 3.1, the router, in order to get out to the internet, so that's correct. And we've also got two DNS servers, 172.25.104.12 and 14. So these are the Wollongong West IT, so that's these two machines here. So these have DHCP, but they're also DNS servers. So that means if I type in ping, say Google, then these DNS servers will resolve the name of Google back to what its current IP address is. And we need that functionality. So we're going to test that. So I'm going to see if I can ping one of those external DNS servers, and I'm going to also see if I can ping Google. So ping 172.25.104.12, and you can see that I can ping it. If I can ping it, then my DNS resolution will also work. So if I ping www.google.com.au, that will resolve back to an IP address. There it is. The ping doesn't actually work because we're in the TAFE system, and TAFE doesn't allow us to ping through their network quite wisely, I believe. So I'll just Control-C that. Oops, Control-C is just not working for the moment. Why is that? Okay, now it works. Okay, so we can see that we can ping through our front firewall, so it's obviously set up okay, and that we can also DNS resolve a website out on the internet. So if we have the right proxy settings set up on this machine, then we'll also be able to web browse out into the internet. So let's just check that. I'm going to open up my Internet Explorer. It's set to go to msn.com. It should get there provided our proxy settings are correct. And it does look like it gets there. So I'll just test www.google.com. Does it get to Google? Yes, it does. If I look at images and go Fox or X, whatever. X, there you go, X works. Fox. We get Foxes. Okay, so the internet is accessible. Our network infrastructure setup is quite fine through our front firewall here. So our Windows 2016 server gets out to the internet through our front firewall, so we must have NAT set up on here. What I'd like to show in this video also is how to actually do that. So let's web browse into this IP address here, 192.168.3.1, which is the management port for this router, and just check how this is all set up. Okay, so on our device here, we're going to go to 192.168.3.1, which is our gateway, and it does get there. And we want more information. No, continue to the website actually. So the password for this, if we have a quick look at our front firewall, just to the left of the cursor here, you'll see the username is admin and the password is ZeroShell. So we'll type in admin and ZeroShell. And I'm going to remember that so I can come back to it later. And if I click on to the left here under the network, I'm going to click on router. And I'm going to have a look at the NAT, or network address translation setup. And I believe this is working, otherwise we would not have been able to get out to the internet. So NAT is actually set up on the Ether 00 port, and that's how you would actually set NAT up. You just put it into the port or take it out as necessary, okay? And then hit the save function, and that puts the Ethernet as a NAT enabled interface. So NAT's really easy to set up on this ZeroShell. The other thing that we need to set up is RIP. So on our network diagram, we've got NAT set up on the first interface. We want RIP set up on the second interface, so that these two routers can talk to each other using that routing information protocol and tell each other about the networks that they know about, and so that we can update the routing table on both of these routers to include every network that's visible, okay? So we go to RIP, and you can see that Ether 001 has been enabled for RIP. So normally what you do is you'd click enabled to make it active, then move the correct interface across to the RIP enabled and hit the save button over in this top right hand corner. So now that's done, I'm going to click on the routing table here to have a look at what our routing table looks like. And you'll see that the subnet 103 has been passed to this front firewall via the router. So I must have RIP set up on the router already as well. So in order to get to this 103 subnet, I have to go through 3.254. So if we have a quick look at our network diagram, I'm here. In order to get to the 103 subnet over here, I have to go through this 3.254 address. Okay, so in order for this packets from this machine here, our front firewall, to get to, say, our Windows 10 machine out here, I have to go through this router, through that interface, 3.254. Okay, so it looks like the setup on these routers has already been done. It's like set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up another tab, and I'm going to put in the second router's IP address, so 192.168.3.254, and we're going to continue to that website, type in admin and ZeroShell, and hit login, remember the address, and I'm going to go down to our router and look at our RIP. And we can see that Ether 00 has been RIP enabled, and we're going to look at our routing table. And you can see here that the 172.25.104 subnet has been put into the routing table, and the way to get to that is through 3.1. It's been supplied via RIP. Okay, so the routers have been talking to each other and updating the routing tables depending on the networks that they know about, and they pass it on to the next router. So that's pretty handy. The other thing that we need to look at on these routers, according to our network diagram, is whether we've set up DHCP on the second interface on the front firewall and also the second interface on the router, this one here. So let's go and check that. So let's look at the first machine. Let's go on in our network and look at our DHCP settings. And you can see that attached to the Ether01 is a DHCP server that's 192.168.3.100 to 200, and that we've got a default gateway of 3.1, which is what gets passed on to the client machine, and also the DNS server is our DC1, our 2016 server, which is 3.2. So this appears to be all set up correct, and we'll go to our our router, and have a look at its DHCP settings. So we'll go down to DHCP here, and you can see that it's already set up as well. So how do you set up a DHCP range? Okay, so I'm going to disable this and set it back up again so that you can see how it's done. So I'm going to go remove that subnet. So normally when you came in here, it would look like this. Warning that there's not a DHCP service running. So we would need to go to, for the subnet, we need to go new, find the available subnets and plug in the Ether01 subnet, which is this interface here, Ether01, and go OK. And so that creates a basic DHCP, but it doesn't have a range. So what we're going to do is put in 192.168.103.100 to 192.168.103.200. And the default gateway that the client would get in this subnet is 103.1, but the DNS server is incorrect. Our DNS server in our network diagram here is this 2016 server, which is 3.2. So I need to change the DNS setting that this Windows 10 machine is going to see via this DHCP to show that it's 3.2 is the DNS server. Okay, so let's put in 3.2 in there, and we're going to hit the save button to save all of those changes. And now our Windows 10 machine should get, that's plugged into switch 2, should get an IP address somewhere in that range and have these settings. We're going to test that to make sure that our Windows 10 machine does actually get our IP address correctly and can get out to, well, it won't get out to the internet until we turn our 3.2, our 2016 server, into a DNS server. So what we could do is we could actually put in here 172.25.104.12 as a secondary DNS server. So that pointed out to our Wollongong West WWIT1. And we could also put in the 172.25.104.14, which is the WWIT2 server. Now I'll put both of those in. I'm going to have to hit the save again. We've got 3 DNS servers in there now. And later on we'll be able to get rid of these 2 Wollongong West servers and just rely on our local server. But until we actually promote this machine to being a domain controller and also a DNS server, then we need these other 2 in order for our Windows 10 machine plugged into switch 2 to get out to the internet. So let's check that. That's all been saved. Let's go to our Windows 10 machine to make sure that it actually gets an IP address. So down to here to our Windows 10 machine. This thing is currently plugged into, well, it's currently plugged into NAT. So let's plug it into our internal network to switch 2. Okay, let's start this machine up. Okay, so let's type in password 9. Okay, so there it is. And what we want is CMD, command prompt. And I want to pin that to the taskbar so I can find it from now on. And exit out. There it is on the taskbar. So if I open that up, I'll do an ipconfig/all. Okay, so what we can see here is DHCP enabled is yes, and that we've got an IP address of 192.168.103.100, which is exactly what we expected off our DHCP server that's on our router. It tells us that the gateway is 103.1 and that the DHCP server is 103.1. And it's also got the 3 DNS servers that we put on that DHCP server. So let's see what our connectivity is for this Windows 10 machine. How far can it get out? So first of all, we ping our gateway, ping 192.168.103.1, and it gets there. Let's ping the next router, which is actually the front firewall. So let's go to 3.1, and it also gets to 3.1, which means it should also get to 3.2, which is the server, and it does. So let's see if it gets further than our front firewall out to the internet, out to our Wollongong West IT DHCP service. So let's go 172.25.104.12. So it does get to our DNS server out in our Wollongong West network, and 14 should also get there. Yep. Okay, so can this thing DNS resolve? That's the next question. Can I ping www.google.com? And you can see that I get a name resolution back to an IP address here. So DNS is working as well. So assuming that this machine has the right proxy settings, we will get out to the internet. Now at the moment, I haven't set any proxy settings in here, I don't think. So we don't actually ping through the TAFE network because they don't allow us, which is a good idea. I'm going to go iExplore. Let's see if our search engine finds it. It's rather slow. We do have Google on here. So we can test to see whether we get out to the internet using Google. Sorry, using Chrome. Let's go www.google.com. Now remember, we pinged this and we could ping it. Now we're not resolving, we can resolve it, but we don't get out because we haven't set up any proxy settings in this machine yet. However, I would like to automate the giving of proxy settings out to machines from our server some point in time. So I'm not going to fix this by putting in proxy settings, or I could test that it works and then take them back out again so that we can automate it later on. So we might just do that to start with. Can I set the proxy settings from in here? If I go down to advanced, can I see at the bottom, I went to advanced, if I go to system, system, okay. So surely in here somewhere is the proxy settings. Can I get to that? Change your computer's proxy settings, there it is. Okay, so this is setting up manual proxy settings. I could turn that on, put in, whoops, that's for using a script. Don't want to do that. I want to turn on the proxy, and I'll go proxy dot TAFE New South Wales .edu.au and port number 8080 and go save. I think I have saved it, so I'll just click it again just to make sure, and then I'll exit, because it doesn't actually exit out, which is a bit weird. The proxy settings are in there, so let's just see if I can get to Google now. Refresh. Or maybe reload. I think that's the same thing. Yep, so reload got there to Google. Images. Let's pick something else. Isetter. Okay, so we get images, so we're obviously out to the internet, so that's basic connectivity. It's all working, that's what we want. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these proxy settings so that we can deliver those via a group policy later on. So let's just see if I can get to them via the interface. If I go to network and internet, one thing I've noticed with the latest version of Windows 10 is that this configuration app seems to be a little bit broken, and they can sit there maxing out the processor. It seems to be a real problem, so next time I create a sysprepped version of this, I'll make sure all the patches are in place and that it's all working quite fine before I sysprep it and stick it out as an appliance. Okay, so I'm going to go the backdoor way, the way I did using Google Chrome to get in there instead. Okay, so we use our settings. I think I have to go advanced settings, don't I? Advanced, yep. And then I've got a few more areas that I can go to, and one of those is the proxy settings. So this configuration, or this config app seems to be fairly broken. I'm going to turn that all off and hit the save button. So did that work or not? I'm not sure. I've hit save about 5 times there. I'm assuming that it's working, so if I go back in, now that I've turned proxy off, that's cached, so let's try a different website, www.dogpile.com. Let's see if it gets there. So if our proxy's turned off, it won't get there. Because at the moment we don't want the proxy on. So it's not getting there. The Google page did get there, but that was because it was cached on the local drive from the last time that we used it. So I can exit that. The proxy settings are turned off. Later on, we're going to get our Windows 10 having its proxy settings delivered automatically. So I'm going to minimise this out of the road. We've now tested our entire network to make sure that our connectivity is quite fine, internet access is fine, ping results, everything's fine. So now it's a matter of actually promoting our first domain controller. And so here on our DC1 domain controller, what I'm going to do is go back to the dashboard, and I'm going to add roles and features. And normally I just skip this page by default, but whatever, next. So we get a choice now of whether we do a role-based or a feature-based installation, or we do a remote desktop services installation. So obviously we're doing the role-based installation, and we go next. And we select the server. We're selecting this server 3.2, which is DC1. Next. And what we tick is the second box from the top, which is, so let's go back, Active Directory Domain Services. So I tick that box. It then asks us to add all the right features. So I'm going to click Add the Features. So we've added the server role and all the features already. But the next page would then ask us if we want to add the features, but we've already done that. So group policy management, that sort of stuff. So I suppose it's if you want to add any other additional features, you could add them in here. So at the moment we're just doing our domain controller installation, so we'll just use the defaults. So next, it suggests something about Azure, which we're not worried about at the moment. Next. It gives me a summary of what I'm suggesting, and then the install button. So when you hit the install button, you'll see eventually this thing will start to scroll across the screen as it's doing the installation. Okay, so you can see the first part of it. We'll come back to this when we get to the end. Okay, so we can see that the installation has started. I can't see that it's finished yet. That doesn't stop. You can actually close this and can come back in and have a look at some other point in time and go away and do something else. So if you close it, we've actually got a couple of services that aren't running either, which that's. And here it's it just says the installation has started on the domain controller. So I might just go and find out what these services are that. Download Maps Manager and Google Update Service. Well, neither of those are really important. So having those stopped, automatic delayed start, not really that important. So I'm not going to worry about those. And what I want to see is how far this thing's got. Okay, so it's still there at the moment. So we'll just pause until this thing gets a bit further along. Okay, so this installation has now succeeded. It actually took quite a bit of time, and we'll move on from here. So I'll close this. And have a look at the notification here. We can see that as a post-deployment part of the configuration is to promote this server to becoming a domain controller. So the first part, installing the roles and the features, was really just the prerequisites required for this machine to then be promoted to being a domain controller. So that's what we do with this hyperlink here. Now, this needs to be followed reasonably well. When we're making a new domain, we have to consider whether the promotion of this server to being a domain controller is an existing, adding a domain controller to an existing domain. So that's not the case here. Nor are we adding a domain to an existing forest. What we're doing is we're creating a brand new forest. Okay. So we're going to add to a new forest. And the root domain name here, just use your initials, something like BMW, that's my initials, .local. So it doesn't matter which one you use, really. Initials are nice and easy. What you'll see here is that it floats across the top here, that's it working. So when you see when the bar's finished, it drops out and you've got access. So here we've got two important things, the forest functional level and the domain functional level. So when we look at the forest functional level, we can change this so that it supports previous versions of server operating systems. Back to 2008, in fact. Can't go back any further than that, but 2008 is quite fine. We could also change, if the forest functional level is set to 2016, then obviously the domain functional level can only be 2016. If I set this to server 2008, then I could actually change the functional level to actually support, for this domain, servers back to, say, 2012 if I wanted to. Now, we know for the setup of this particular domain here that we need, that really server 2016 is quite fine, because we're going to put server 2016 and server 2019. So just leaving the domain and functional, the forest and the domain functional levels at server 2016, that is the oldest version of server that will be supported in this domain. Okay, so we can't go and put a 2012 in later on. You'll also notice that the domain naming server DNS is ticked, that box is ticked, which is a good thing because we haven't got one yet. And also that the global catalog server is greyed out but ticked. The very first domain controller in the first domain in the forest must be a global catalog server, and therefore it's just ticked and greyed out so that we can't change it. I'm going to then put a new password in for the recovery or the restore mode. So password 9. Password 9. Next. Here it comes up with a warning and says that a delegation for a DNS server could not be created because the authoritative parent zone could not be found, which means I can't find a DNS server. Okay, which is okay because we've got the box ticked for this thing to become a DNS server. So we're not really worried about that warning. That's fine. We're just going to go next. It's going to come up with the NetBIOS name. Now, NetBIOS is a non-routable networking protocol that only works in the current subnet, local area network. Okay, so this will only work within the 192.168.3 subnet. And so it doesn't need the full domain name. It just can use the NetBIOS version of the name, which is the short version. So I could just go BMW and it would work. Later on, when we put our Windows 10 machine into the domain, because it's not in the same subnet, I can't just put in BMW and it will find it. I'll have to put the full domain name bmw.local in order for it to be able to join the domain. We'll try that out. Okay, so I'm going to go next here for the NetBIOS name. The default places where Active Directory puts its databases and things like that, I don't mess with that because there's lots of other additional applications or features that you might want to install that assume that they're in the default places. So just leave it and go next. It gives us a summary of what we've suggested. That's all okay, so we're just going to go next. It does a prerequisites check here and it comes up with two errors. The two errors will read out when they come up, but one of them is actually the DNS error. So you can see here the second one here, the delegation for the DNS server can't be created because the authoritative parent. That sounds familiar. So we already know about that, but we also know that we're going to create our own DNS server, so that's just a warning and it doesn't really matter because we're going to create our own DNS server. This other thing here is just a warning to say that we're compatible with NT4. So this thing here is compatible with Windows NT4, backward compatibility. So that's okay. If we drag this down, we can actually see that the prerequisite check completed and that it all passed successfully, and we can just click install to begin the installation. We've also got a little green tick up here that just says pass successfully, click install. So we're just going to click install, and this is going to install the domain controller functionality. The first thing it's going to do is go through these error warnings, and you can see it says waiting for a DNS installation to finish. So even though we've got this warning about the DNS server can't be pointed to another DNS server, it's going to create its own. So this doesn't take too long. You'll see the little caterpillar crawling across the top here while it's working, and we'll wait until it finishes. What it tries to do at the finish of this is it does a reboot. You can see it's actually creating Active Directory parts, setting the DNS settings, securing the machine software. So it's doing stuff, creating policies. It's now finished and wants to do a reboot. So we're going to go OK, close, and close all that and let it do a reboot. Okay, so now when it restarts, this will want to start back in and log you into a domain rather than just being a local machine in a work group. I think the shutdown and the restart actually takes longer than doing the install. When it restarts the first time as a domain controller, it actually takes quite a bit of time. It's still continuing to do the setup of all the domain structures.
That's why you just want to automate everything if you can to a certain point.
Yeah.
Which works.
Okay, so my server has restarted, and I'm going to inject a Control-Alt-Delete using the host key and right control key and delete. And you can see here that it's now wanting to start up in the BMW domain as the administrator. So here's password 9 and log in. Okay, so it's logged back in and it's going to pop up the server manager as it normally does. And when we open up the server manager, you'll see that it's still got services coming in. It still needs to populate down here, and there's probably a little, okay, so we can see Active Directory and DNS have popped up in there. And we can use those to access those features. I prefer to use the tools over in here. So if I click on tools, you'll now see a lot more Active Directory stuff in here that wasn't there before. We'll also see DNS. We'll also see group policy, amongst other things. Okay, so there's a lot more stuff in the tools now that were installed as part of being a domain controller. So what we want to look at first of all is DNS. So DNS is the name resolution back to an IP address. So if I double click on DNS, it'll pop that open. Here it is. And I'm going to expand out the name of this machine, DC1. So if I expand that out, I can see in forward lookup zones, I can expand that out and I can see the domain bmw.local. When you click on bmw.local, you see what is a typical DNS setup. So here we'll have a thing called the start of authority, and that points to dc1.bmw.local, which is the name of this server appended to the name of the domain. And so this is the fully qualified domain name of this machine, dc1.bmw.local. You'll also see that the name server is on the same machine. So it tells us start of authority and name server are on here. And it tells us that DC1's got an IP address of 3.2. So later on, when we join other machines to the domain, they will automatically update the DNS on this machine and put their current IP address in there as well. Okay, so that's typical. That's what we want to see. The reason why I came into the DNS is to do a right mouse click on the name of the server and go down to properties and look at the forwarders. So we look at the tab that says forwarders. You can see here that if this DNS server can't resolve the name back to an IP address, it's going to pass that request on to the next DNS server, which are the two Wollongong West IT 1 and 2 servers out in our WWIT Labs network. Those have forwarders out to the TAFE DNS servers. The TAFE DNS servers have pointers out to their internet service provider and so forth, all the way up to one of the 12 top-level DNS servers in the world. And so a DNS request will go all the way up to the top and all the way down to the machine, the one that we're looking for, if necessary. Often you'll find that an internet service provider's DNS has got a lot of shortcuts in it, so that we don't have to go all the way up to the top level DNS servers. We can sort of skip across the DNS tree and find the machine that we're after. So if we're looking for google.com.au or something like that, for example, our internet service provider's probably got a record of that actually in its DNS server. So we only have to go up to our internet service provider and no further in order to resolve that name back to an IP address. So anyway, DNS is very important, having these forwarders so that if this DNS server doesn't know what to do with it or can't resolve it, that it can pass it on to the next DNS server up the chain. Okay, so that's important for us to know. Later on, we're going to install a second domain controller, and we're going to put DNS on that one as well. So we've got two DNS servers. Okay. The next tool that we want to look at under tools is Active Directory users and computers. So when we look at Active Directory users and computers, we can see our domain here, and I'm going to expand that out, and I'm going to have a look at domain controllers, and you can see that the DC1 is a domain controller, and it's also a global catalog. Now, if you remember when we promoted this to being a domain controller, it said that it was going to be a global catalog and it was greyed out and we couldn't change it. So the very first domain controller in the domain in the forest must be a global catalog. So what does a global catalog do? What a global catalog does is allows people to authenticate or to log in to a domain. So we've got to have at least one of those in every forest. Okay. Now normally you'd have one in every domain, on every domain controller if possible. So you can set up global catalogs all over the place. And normally what you'd do is you'd set up a global catalog, which is the service that actually authenticates the login, that actually processes the login request. You'd want that one of those in every site in every domain. So let's just say here at Wollongong West, I would have a global catalog somewhere on site so that everybody who's logging in to the domain here on this site, it's got a local server. It doesn't have to go back across a wide area network connection. It can be all processed at LAN speeds, maybe gigabit generally. So if we look at computers, you'll see that there's no other computers in there at the moment. The other thing I'd like to show is if I do a right mouse click on the domain name, I can change the or raise the domain functional level at this point as well. Now I don't actually want to do that at the moment. We need to support Server 2016, Server 2019. There's this other thing called operations masters, and we have operations masters in every domain and also in every forest. So there's 2 forest-based roles and 3 domain-based roles that has to be on a single server. And because this is the first domain controller in the first domain that's in the forest, this server has all of them. It's got all 5. So we can see here that the relative ID master, which gives out IDs, relative, like random IDs, to every object in Active Directory, whether it's a group, whether it's a user, whether it's a computer, whether it's a policy, whatever. Every object in Active Directory gets a unique identity that's given out by the relative ID master. Okay, so we've got to have one of those in every domain. There's also this PDC emulator role, which emulates the functions of a primary domain controller. And really that's only there for pre-Windows 2000 clients. Not likely to happen in any network these days. So it's really there for compatibility with old networks. However, it does have a preferential replication of password changes for all networks. Okay, so while the pre-Windows 2000 clients is not likely in any modern network, having a preferential replication of all password changes is a good function that the PDC emulator has. So it's good for that reason, and that's why we have one. The infrastructure master keeps a track of the logical shape of connections. So do we have a connection between this domain and another domain, like a parent or a child domain? Which users are in which groups? Which groups are connected to which other groups? All of those sorts of things are functionally connected, and so the infrastructure master keeps a track of how everything is connected together. That's the best way of looking at it. So it keeps a track of all of the links, how things are linked together. And you can see that the operations master is currently on DC1, but I could actually transfer it to another domain controller. And if I've got more than one domain controller in a domain, I would certainly separate some of these roles to share the load, rather than having them all on one computer. Now, what often happens in networks is that the first domain controller in the domain has all the roles, and then it being the oldest computer in the domain, which one is likely to fail first? The oldest one. Okay, so it's this machine that's likely to fail first. When this thing fails, then none of these operational master roles are being used, and then we can no longer add new objects to Active Directory because we no longer have a relative ID master. We can no longer change who's connected to which group or some of this logical infrastructure, the way it's all connected, because we don't have an infrastructure master. So these things are important to have in the domain, and this role is actually on every single domain controller in the domain, but there's only one read-write version, and it's on this server. So if this server actually catastrophically failed, like it caught on fire and died or something like that, we could get another domain controller and promote it to being the relative ID master, primary domain controller emulator, or infrastructure master, provided this machine never ever comes back up again. Okay, so once we transfer the roles to another domain controller, this machine can no longer have those roles. So if the thing went down for a hardware problem and we transferred the roles, then we'd need to make sure that this machine never comes up as a domain controller again, because these are single operational master roles. There's only a single domain controller that can actually have these roles. Okay, so there's our domain, and what we're going to do now is join another computer to the domain. We know that we've got our DNS, and that this thing points to additional DNS servers, and So I'm going to get my domain controller 2, which is this one, and I'm going to get it to join the domain. Control delete, no, not working, so let's go input, keyboard, insert a Control Alt Delete. No, it doesn't want to do anything. Maybe it needs a reboot. Machine, ACPI shutdown. Okay. That powered off really, really fast. Okay, so my suspicions is it was dead in the water anyway. So let's power that up and see if we can get it working again. And we're going to also look at our Windows 10 machine and see if we can get it to join the domain as well. And this looks like it's dead in the water as well. Can we input a keyboard, Control Alt Delete into that? Not moving. Okay. Very interesting. So I've got a few dead machines that I need to reboot. Unfortunate. Okay, let's do them one at a time. Okay. So inject a Control Alt Delete. That now works. Log in as password 9 as the administrator, local administrator. So before we can promote this machine to being a domain controller, we need to get it to join the domain first and then promote it to being a domain controller. So that's what we're going to do. Don't worry about that anymore. We're going to check our DC1 is there. Okay, DC2 is here. It's still got 4 services not running yet. So what services are they? Maps, user access logging service. That's probably a useful one to have. Distributed transaction coordinator is also useful. So what we could do is we could go highlight all these things, right mouse click and tell them to start. Let's see if that works. What I also need to do, like I just tried to start those services, they look like they've started now. Okay, so everything's up and running. I'm going to go to local server. This thing's set up as DC2. The firewall is still on. We've got an IP address. Enhanced security is turned off. So what I need to do is turn off the firewall and then get this to get out of the workgroup and into the domain. So let's have a quick look at the firewall. This one is the one that's active. So I'm going to actually turn it off. And do a refresh. It should go off. So, okay, the firewall is currently off. The other thing I want is a command prompt. CMD. Right mouse click and pin it to the taskbar. That's a good idea. So let's open up a command prompt and do an ipconfig/all. And we can see that we've got all the right sorts of IP addresses, and also DNS 3.2 is important here because we're trying to join the domain on the server that's at that address. Okay, so and it's now a DNS server, so unless we've got this DNS setting on our machine, we can't join that other domain. Static IP address 3.3, okay. And we should be able to ping 192.168.3.2. It's not, okay, so maybe I don't have this thing plugged in the correct place. So let's have a look. Devices, network. Yep, plugged into NAT. It's plugged in the wrong place, so we need to connect that into our internal network into switch 1. Okay, so let's, yes, it's found the network, I can see that. Let's up arrow and run that ping again. So now you can see it can actually ping the server. So I'm plugged into the right network, I can ping it. My DNS settings on the card are set the right way, so I should be able to join the domain. So how do we do that? See where it says work group here? I'm going to click on work group and I'm going to hit the change button and I'm going to tell it to join a domain, and it's going to be, now I should be able to just put in BMW. Remember, this is the NetBIOS version of the name, and it should find a thing that's in the same subnet. And remember, these are both in the 3 subnet, 192.168.3 subnet, so it should find it and join the domain. Let's go next. Okay, and then it pops up a dialog box that says give me an account that has permissions to allow you to join the domain. So I'm going to put in administrator and password 9 and hit OK. Now we'll see if it pops up and welcomes me into the domain. Very slowly. Yep. So here it says welcome to the BMW domain. So I just used the NetBIOS version of it and it worked. So it says I must restart to apply all the changes. So I'm going to hit restart, close, restart now. It'll restart my domain controller too. It's now going to have joined the domain. If I go back to my DC1 and open up the Active Directory users and computers, I should be able to see when I expand my domain and have a look at the domain controllers. Here's my DC1, look at the computers, there's my DC2. Because I've got it to join into the domain, it's now there. If I also open up the DNS and expand that out, expand out the forward lookup zone, expand out my domain, I'll now see that DC2 has automatically put an entry into the DNS with its current IP address of 3.3. So that's working perfectly the way it should. Here's my machine that's restarted. Right host key delete. I don't want to log in as the local administrator. I want to log in to as the domain administrator. So I'm going to go other user and I'm going to sign in to the BMW domain. So if I type in administrator, look what happens. It goes back to logging into the local machine. So what I need to do is I need to put in front of this BMW /. So now it's going back into the domain as the domain administrator. Password 9 is the password. And I'm logging into the domain as the domain administrator. Okay, so the server managers come up and here's our domain controller 2. It's now a member of the domain. If I go back to, oh actually we did that already. We went back to have a look at Active Directory and we could see that it's in there, and on our Active Directory users and computers, it's actually in there as a computer. So it's now appeared, it's now a member of the domain, and we've logged in as a domain administrator. So the tools here you can see don't contain any of the Active Directory stuff because we have not yet promoted this thing to being a domain controller. Okay, so what I'm going to do is minimize this. I'm going to come back and put Windows 10 in as well. So looking at my Windows 10 machine, there it is. Did this thing do a restart? No, it didn't. So let's go machine, ACPI shutdown. Oof, it came up with a memory error. Fantastic. Terminate the program. Okay, let's go back in and restart it. So Windows 10 got aborted at that time. So we essentially yanked the power plug on it. So let's start it back up and see if it actually comes up okay. That could be fun. We might have to get it back from an appliance and rebuild it. So currently we've got domain controller 1. It is a domain controller. DC2 is logged into the domain. It's a member of the domain, but it's just a computer at the moment. It hasn't been promoted to being a domain controller. And we're going to look at Windows 10 and putting that into the domain as well. Okay, so it's ready. I'll log in. Password 9. Okay, with this latest version of Windows 10, which is the 20H2 version, it's moved stuff around and it's hard to find where things actually are anymore. Good fun. So I'm going to type into here and see if I can go work group. And here you can change the work group name. Okay, so I'm going to click on that. It's in the control panel. And so I've got immediately to the dialog box that I need to get this thing to. And you'll notice that the full name of this is an awkward name. Okay, but I can change this all in one hit. You can't do that on a server, but you can do it on a workstation. Okay, so I'm going to go change. I'm going to change the name to Win 10 Pro, and I'm going to change the domain to BMW. Now, because I'm using the NetBIOS name and this is not in the same subnet, this should fail. Okay, so let's give it a try. What I really need to do is to give the fully qualified domain name, bmw.local. So it said it couldn't find BMW, and because I'm using NetBIOS, NetBIOS does not get out of that subnet. It's non-routable. It can't go through the router into the 3 subnet. Okay, so I need to go bmw.local. And immediately it comes up with administrator and password 9. And we'll go OK on that. And this thing will join the domain. Welcome to the domain. You must restart, of course. Close, restart now. Okay, so if I go back to my DC1 machine, if I refresh the computers here now, you'll find that the Windows 10 Pro machine is in there as well. So now I've got a Windows 10 Pro machine in there as well. As we expected, I'm going to go back to DNS, and if I do a refresh on this, I should see my Windows 10 machine pop up in here as well. Refresh. Not yet. So when the machine restarts, it will put it in there. Because at the moment it doesn't actually have an IP address. Remember, it's dynamic, so it's got to get one, and then it will put itself in there. Okay, so where's my Windows 10 machine? Here it is. It's restarting. Okay, so we're now ready to log in, but what I want to do is I want to log in to the domain, so I'm going to go other user, and I'm going to log in as administrator, and you'll notice that because I put administrator and there is already a local administrator account, it wants to sign into the local machine first. So again, in here I need to put in BMW / to force it to go into the domain as the domain administrator. So password 9 and sign in. And once this is signed in, it should update the DNS once it's got an IP address. We're going to check the IP address in a minute. Okay, so this is interesting. Because I logged in as a different user, BMW/administrator, that's a new profile. It's a different profile from what was on the machine before, so it's now creating a new profile. And so it does the usual Windows 10 thing of hello, hi, we're here, this might take a few minutes, blah, 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 and creates a profile. Where does it create the profile from? It takes the default profile that's on the local machine and copies it. Now, if I had a profile on the domain, it would use that instead. And you could do that. You can actually set up a profile in your domain with all the settings that you want, and so every new account that gets created has all the right icons on the desktop, for example. Okay, so I could do that. This is in the domain now, so what I want to do is do a command prompt, cmd, sometime before Christmas would be great. Yeah, but I want to send this to the taskbar. Pin to the taskbar. I did press the button to pin it to the taskbar. It's just how effective is it? So let me run it as well. Open it. Yeah, it did pin it to the taskbar, which is good. And it ran it, so I want an IP config/all because I want to see that I've actually got an IP address of 103.100 and I've got all these, because I had the right DNS setting, that's how I was able to join the domain. I need to actually get rid of these additional DNS settings now because I don't need them. The important thing is that's my IP address, it's working. I'm going to check back on my DC1 machine. Here it is, back in DNS, hit the refresh button and you can see that my Win 10 Pro has automatically put in its current IP address of 103.100. So when we talk about DNS in Windows, it's actually called dynamic DNS because it will, every client machine will automatically update the DNS server, which is very handy. That means all machines within the domain now have got a way of just typing in, ping DC2 and it will go ping it. Okay, so let's try that from here. Let's go ping DC2. Oh, it failed. Why did it fail? Because the firewall is still on. Okay, let's ping DC1 because DC1 we turned it off. Okay, so what I need to do is go to DC2 and turn off the firewall so that I can ping it. So let's go to here, right mouse click on that and look at the firewalls. There's the firewall. And you can see that the domain network is active and the firewall is on. So I'm going to click on that and go off. And I'm going to go back to my Windows 10 machine, hit the up arrow and to go to DC2. And it didn't work. Okay, wonder why. Might have to come back to that one. We'll do a bit of troubleshooting along the way and find out why that did not ping. If I do trace route, trace RT, -D to stop it from trying to do a DNS lookup, and tell it to go to 172.25.104.12. That shows me that it went to the router, then the firewall, and then got to the machine. So if I go to DC1, it name resolves back to the fully qualified domain name. DC1 is dc1.bmw.local. And what its current IP address is, because it got that out of DNS, and then goes to the router and then to the server. So it seems to be DC1 is working. Let's try DC2. Okay, so we've got a DNS issue here. It's not resolving. Or it says unable to resolve the target system name DC2. Okay. It might be case sensitive. So let's go DC2. No, it's not. Okay. It still says it's unable to resolve the target system name, which sounds like a DNS error. Yep. Okay, so let's go back to our DNS server on here. We've got DC2, it's in there, and it knows that its IP address is 3.3, which is correct. So let's just see if I can ping the IP address. Ping 192.168.3.3. Yes, I can. So it's definitely a DNS issue, okay? My suspicions is because I've got 3 DNS servers on here, if I scroll up you can see that it knows about 3 DNS servers. This is causing a problem. Okay, so what I need to do is get rid of these 2 DNS servers so we've only just got the one, and then everything should work. Okay, so the way I do that is I go back to my DC1, I open up the web browser, I'm going to web browse into, let's go new tab, 192.168.3.254. So I'm going to web browse into the router. Security thing, yeah, blocked. Okay, so let's go do it again. And continue to the website, log in as admin and log in. So I'm going to go to my DHCP server, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of these 2 settings. And I'm going to hit save. And I'm going to do the same thing on the firewall as well. So I'll go 192.168.3.1 and continue on. Type in admin and the password and log in. Go to DHCP, and it's only got 3.2 anyway, so that's what we wanted. So this one's fine. It was the problem was the one that was in the 103 network off the router rather than off the firewall. So it's fine now. So back to our Windows 10 machine. We're going to go ipconfig Where's ipconfig? There it is. And I'm going to go renew. Get a new IP address. So it should get a new IP address back off the... It'll get the same IP address because it was leased for a certain period of time. If I do an ipconfig/all, you can see that I've now only got one DNS server, so there's no confusion. Okay, so now I'm going to go ping. I could always ping 3.3 anyway. What I want to do is ping the name DC2. So let's trace route to DC2. It gets straight there. Okay, so I got rid of the DNS issue with Windows 10 by getting rid of extraneous DNS servers in its list. Okay, so I can ping. So I should be able to just go ping DC2, ping DC2, and it pings it straight away. It doesn't matter whether it's uppercase or lowercase. Let's go uppercase, same thing. Okay, so now we've got all the connectivity that we're supposed to have. This thing's joined the domain. We don't have any DNS issues anymore. Can I ping Google? Now, my local DNS server, which is DC1 3.2, doesn't have Google in its DNS list. If we have a look here on its DNS list, there's no Google in here. But if I go ping www.google.com.au, it resolves the name back to an IP address, which in this case, Control C, is that IP address there. Okay. And if I look at google.com rather than do google.com.au, you can see I get a different IP address. Okay. Control C. But I can't actually ping it because I can't ping through the TAFE network. What happens is the DNS server that's over here on DC1 does not have www.google.com in there, but it has got a forwarder, and it forwards it out to the TAFE, and it also gets out to, and goes further out to the internet. Okay. So if I can get out to the TAFE network, can I ping the Wollongong West server 1? So if I just go ping WWIT1, it won't get there. Okay. What I need to do is give it its fully qualified domain name. Remember, my machines came in with fully qualified. So if I go wwitlabs.local, which is the domain name for the Wollongong West network. Whoops, got to put a dot in there. A dot in there. And ping that, it now resolves. So it resolves that name back to its actual IP address and then pings it. So this is pinging from my Windows 10. So if I do a trace route to the same thing, trace route wwit1.wwitlabs.local. It trace routes, and because I didn't put the -d in there, it tries to get the names as well. So it comes up with the names. So you can see it goes to the router, then to the front firewall, which then lets it out into the 172 subnet and then gets to the actual server. So if I do this again with a -d in the middle here, -d, that says do not use DNS lookup, so don't try and find the names of the machines along the way and just go straight there. So you can see the difference. It no longer puts the name in the list. So -d will just go that's the IP, that's the IP, that's the IP, without putting in the DNS name. Okay, so now we've got all that basic connectivity in place and we've got things joined to the domain. We're going to look at promoting our DC2 machine up to being a second domain controller. So I'm going to log in back into the domain. Sorry, back in, yeah, so I'm going to log back in again. And I'm just going to move this Windows 10 machine a bit out of the road. So I've got DC1 here and DC2 here. And I'm going to, this is joined to the domain, so now I just need it to promote it to being a domain controller. So I'm going to go on the dashboard, I'm going to add roles and features, and it's the same process. We're going to go next, role-based, feature-based installation next. It's on this machine, 3.3, DC2, as a member of the domain. And select the destination server. Okay, we've just got to wait for it to crawl across the top here and okay, so now we're going to tick the box for Active Directory domain services and then go OK to the features that it suggests. So there's the features, we're going to add those features and we're going to go next. We've already ticked the features, so that's fine, go next. That's all about Azure services, so we just go next. Here's a summary of what we're asking for it to do. We're going to go install. And so this thing's going to crawl across here. It did it very slowly for our first domain controller. Let's see how this one goes. Okay, so we've now finished the prerequisite installation for turning this thing into a domain controller. So I can close this, go to the notifications and promote this thing to being a domain controller. Now, when we're looking at promoting this to being a domain controller, this is going to be adding a domain controller to an existing domain. Okay, you can see it's already popped in the current domain that I'm logged into, that I'm a member of, as bmw.local. So I'm going to say this is an additional domain controller in an existing domain. This is the domain. The credentials is bmw/administrator, which is the current user. That's correct. So I'm just going to go next. Now, I can untick Global Catalog Server. I can also untick DNS Server. I actually want this DNS server to, I want to install DNS on this machine as well. And it also tells us the default site name. And password 9 and password 9. And I'm going to go next. I'm not going to update the DNS, the authoritative parent zone. Interesting. I should actually point this thing towards our DC1. Let me go back to my DC1 machine and I'm just going to make sure that that DNS is published into Active Directory. So if I click on our DC1, look at all tasks, start, stop, pause, restart, update the server data files, configure DNS. Okay, properties. So it's applied against that. Advanced. I can change binding to secondaries. I don't want to do that. Root hints. No. Monitoring, event logging, monitoring. No, okay. So it's not on here. I'm looking for how to actually send this into Active Directory. Start of authority, zone transfers, name server security wins. It's running. Okay. Maybe it's automatically connect to a DNS server, all tasks. Okay, maybe it's automatically published into Active Directory. New zone, aging, scavenging for all zones, update, clear cache. Nope, I can't see where you would do that at the moment. Forward lookup zone, so I don't want a new zone. That's the actual domain itself. So I could create new different types of records. And no, so there's nothing. Okay, so I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to continue to do it. It must automatically publish it into Active Directory. Which in older versions of domains, sometimes you had to actually publish it first. New server, new record, new zone. Okay, so I'm just going to ignore that for the moment. Go back to my server 2 and continue on. Okay, so I'm still here. I'm going to go next. And replicate. Here it's talking about replication, additional options. So we want to replicate from any domain controller, or I can tell it that it only replicates from DC1. I'm going to just tell it to replicate from any domain controller. So if I put multiple domain controllers in, I'd be able to replicate from any one of them. Next. The standard folders, I'm going to leave them where they are. Next. To install this domain controller, the wizard needs to perform the following operations: forest and schema preparation and domain preparation. So we're going to go next. That's fine. Yep, that's all okay. We're going to go next. Oh, sorry, I should have gone back and showed the, if I go back to previous, you can actually view the script on this as well. So if you click on this view script, you can actually see the PowerShell script that you would do in order to do this, if you were just running it from a command line. So that's a handy thing. A lot of these processes you can do that. You can look at the PowerShell script as well. So next. It gives us the same two warnings, and we're going to it passes all the prerequisite tests. We're going to go install. So now it's upgrading the forest, because this is a 2019 server, remember, not a 2016 server. And also the domain. So it's waiting for DNS to finish installing. After it's finished in making this a domain controller, it'll do a reboot. You can see it's replicating. It's replicating critical information from the other domain controller. That's good. And because these two computers are right beside each other on the same switch, in the same subnet, this all works pretty well. So this will restart. I'm going to go back to my domain controller 1, back into Active Directory, and I'm going to have a look at, I'm going to refresh my computers and my domain controllers. So my computer is now only my Windows 10, my DC2's disappeared out of that, and if I click on domain controllers and do a refresh, you can see DC1 and DC2 are now domain controllers. So that's a good thing. That one server has contacted the other server and made all the changes. And you can see that they're both global catalog servers and they're both in the same site. Okay. I often rename this default first site to the actual site that they're in, like Sydney, Wollongong, whatever. Okay, so back to our DC2. Okay, host key delete, to inject a control alt delete, sign in as the administrator of the domain, password 9, and it'll pull up the server manager. And if we have a look at the tools, sorry, it hasn't finished yet because it's got to put in AD and DNS and all that sort of stuff. We still need all the services running as well. So we can either wait for it, or because you can see it's currently working along here, or we can go those services and tell them all to start. Right mouse click start services. Go OK. And those services will start eventually. Yep, you can see they've started. Some of them have started. Yep, they've all started now. They're all green. So now we've got all the same sorts of things as we've got on DC1, we've got on DC2. If we go to tools, we can see all the Active Directory stuff is here. We can also see the DNS and you know, things like group policy management and stuff like that. So let's click on DNS on Domain Controller 2. Expand it out. Forward lookup zone and look at bmw.local. And so now we can see the change that's happened to DNS in that we've got two name servers. So DC1 and DC2, and all of the other settings are all okay. Okay, so we've still got the IP addresses of DC1, DC2 and Windows 10. But it now tells us that we've got two name servers. Okay, so this promotion of this second domain controller has worked quite fine. It's updated DNS properly. One of the other things I'd like to quickly show is, before we finish this particular video, is one of these other Active Directory tools. We're going to look at Active Directory sites and services. Now remember, both of these machines are in the same site. So if I expand out the sites and look at the default first site name, which is the only site we've got, and look at the servers, I can see both servers are there. If I expand these things out, you can see New Technology Directory Services Settings, NTDS. If I expand that out, which you can't, but if I click on it, there's nothing actually in here as yet. But what's going to happen if I hit a refresh, can't see anything yet, is it'll actually set up a replication link between these two domain controllers. And it'll turn up in here. I can actually do a right mouse click on the NTDS settings and I can replicate the configuration to and from the server. Now normally replication is a push-pull type environment. So this allows me to push or pull. And it says that it's replicated the connections, and I'm going to push and pull and hit the refresh button. Nothing as yet. Replicate the configuration. Okay. At some point in time they'll actually create a little link in here that, and especially if you're going between sites, you need to be able to link between the two different sites so that the servers know how to send each other information. especially when you do things like add new users or groups or change passwords or anything like that, it'll actually get replicated. And these servers actually sit in what's effectively a peer-to-peer network of servers, where there's no one that's more important than the other, except for the one that's got all the services, the operational master roles installed on it. Because it'll receive preferential replication of passwords to it. And that's the only advantage it's got over all the other servers in the environment. Because I've only got 2 servers here, but it's quite feasible in larger organisations that you could have dozens to hundreds of servers, okay? And you could have multiple sites. So in here you just go right mouse click, new site, and put it in. The other thing that we can do is inter-site transports between different physical sites. We could set up links between different sites and set up particular servers to act as bridgehead servers between sites. The other thing that we could do in here is install the subnets. So at the moment there's no subnets in here. If I go new subnet, I'm going to put the 192.168.3.0/24 subnet, and it's on the default first site. And the other subnet that's in that default first site is the 103 subnet. So new subnet, 192.168.103.0/24. It's in that default first site. And so if I ever wanted to set up other sites with different subnets in it, all this stuff gets published and all gets mixed around between all the different servers so they know where everything is. So that's what I wanted to show you in here. Can I actually tell this thing DNS settings? Okay, so it knows it's there. All tasks, find, move, new. Okay, so on here, if I go new, I could go new Active Directory domain services connection. So I could put in a connection to the other server manually. So I'm currently on DC1, I want to go to DC2. Oh no, there's already a server, already a connection from this source server to the destination server. Are you sure you want to create another one? So I'm going to go no. Why aren't I seeing it? I just hadn't hit the refresh button. Okay, so it's automatically generated a connection from DC1 to DC2. If I go to DC2, hit the refresh button on that, it's automatically created a connection back to DC1. So if I've got 20 servers, I'll create connections automatically between each other within the site. If I want to go between sites, then I'll have to create them manually. And that's okay. So within a site, if I make a change to a user's password or create a new user or new group or something like that, it gets replicated on an as-needed basis. So it gets replicated almost immediately within the site. But between sites, I can halt, schedule and compress the traffic in order to reduce my telecommunications costs between sites. Now remember, the nighttime, low-cost, off-peak internet in Australia would be different time of the Australian day for New York, Tokyo, London. Okay, so I could have multiple sites that are maybe overseas and they're in different time zones, and therefore they've got a different time of the night when you want to schedule all the replication to happen, so it's at the low cost time of the day, and therefore reduce my telecommunications costs. Also, if I can schedule it to the low cost times of the day and I can also compress it, then I reduce how much I'm actually sending as well. Now this is a bit of a hangback from the old ISDN days of connections between sites and between countries was all done via ISDN, where you paid for the amount of traffic and the distance. So you paid for both. So you wanted to be able to reduce it to the low cost time of the day, and you wanted to compress it so that you could reduce your telecommunications costs. These days when we've got NBN, broadband, it's less of an issue, you know, because the costs just don't increase that much. You know, if we, you know, we've often got unlimited connections to the internet, so whether I send 1 gigabyte or 10 gigabytes doesn't really matter, okay? There's no change in the telecommunications costs. So if I send it in at 2 o'clock in the morning or send it in 10 o'clock in the middle of the day, again, there's no real cost deficit these days for most people who've got a proper broadband network connection. So the idea of intersite transports, halting, scheduling and compressing are now much less important. So often you'll find in modern networks, all servers, even if they're in different countries, will all end up in the same default first site name, and they'll just replicate on an as-needed basis. So these days, the importance of creating sites and scheduling your replication is less important, and because the telecommunications costs have dropped through the floor. Okay, so that's the end of this particular video where we've promoted our domain controllers, we've checked our DNS. I've still got one service here. Why have I got one service that's not downloading Maps Manager? I don't actually care for that. So it's okay, I don't care whether it's working or not. Yeah, so we've got everything all working, and so we'll stop this video here, and the next video we'll look at is setting up users and groups and group policies, and looking at the functionality of our network now that we've actually got the network in place. So we've got the network in place, we've done the initial configuration, we've got multiple domain controllers, we've got all our devices actually into a domain. So now it's just a matter of configuring that and creating the usability that we need out of our domain. So I'll see you in the next video.